Okay, hello everybody. Hope you are having a good week. I am I am lecturing you here from Boston, where we are about to get 2 feet of snow overnight. Um, so it's not the greatest weather for me. Um, okay, so this week we're going to go over a few things related to motivation theory with L2 learning. Okay, so I'm going to start with that, and then I'll go into some of the other things as well, just with the course website and everything at the end. Okay, so for this week, you had to read Chapter 3 from Dornier and Yoshioda. I hope that there wasn't much difficulty with it. I know these are really dense chapters, especially the first 4, because there's so much theory that they're throwing at you. So I'm really hoping that the lectures help a little bit, the discussions help a little bit. If you feel that it's not quite clear, let me know, and I'll come up with something like a handout or something that I can give you that kind of helps to separate it. Or if you would like the handout, just email me. Maybe I'll take a poll afterwards, and if you feel that would be helpful, then I'll go ahead and make that. Okay. So your discussion post number 1. So this is your TED Talk. We were going. I graded all of those this past week, and I just wanted to make some comments on the first few things. A few themes that I saw that popped up a lot. So the main one that I saw a lot was that a lot of you were surprised that compensation of some sort actually led to less motivation in people to do things. Yeah, I also when I first read that or watched that video a while ago, I was surprised by the same thing. And I hope that you're reading from last week and the reading from this week kind of helps to explain that maybe a little bit more. And actually, your discussion question is probably going to have you think about that a little bit more, so that we can kind of try to apply what we've seen in like language learning motivation to this idea. So what might be causing less motivation when compensation is added? I know it's surprising for me because often when we do research in second language studies, we often want to have some sort of compensation for the participants, thinking that, oh well, if we offer money to our participants, it will go, we'll get more people. But this evidence that Dan Pink was talking about seems to be kind of to the contrary. Okay, so I'll have you discuss this a little bit more in your posts this week, but for right now, we'll move on. The other thing that I noticed from your postings was you really have this idea that extrinsic and intrinsic motivations were like a dichotomy, where it's either one or the other. I think we basically took care of that this past week with that reading. So we looked at self-determination theory and how it kind of looks at how extrinsic motivation moves from being extrinsic to more and more intrinsic in nature. Okay, so it starts kind of from completely external forces to being something that is gradually incorporated into the person's own personal or individual norms, their identity, until finally it becomes integrated completely with their individual system. Okay, not to say that the extrinsic versus intrinsic descriptions are unhelpful or inaccurate. I mean, there's some truth to them. We just tend to look at them more from a continuum now. So I mean, it was interesting to see that how prior to last week's discussion, you already had picked up on that a little bit, and so I think those are the 2 main things that people were talking about, or that I saw a lot, like pretty much common in everybody's discussion. But yeah, so one key point to remember when you're doing your discussions, make sure that your individual response should be longer. Okay, so I know I saw a couple people who just kind of put 1 to 2 sentences for their responses. And that's not really going to be enough. It's not going to engage enough with the topic. You really need to stick to that guideline I give you, around of having around 300 words or so. I mean, you can do more or less, but it just needs to be completely. You need to make sure that you're completely answering the questions and showing that you're completely thinking about it. Okay, so just make sure you're doing that. And then importantly, make sure that you are responding to other people. Okay, so something I noticed from this past week that has led me to create new rules, and I'll actually email all of you this as well. But so your first response to your discussion questions, your individual response, from now on will be due no later than Thursday night at 11:59 p.m. Okay, so this makes it so that you have your responses all done, and it gives your classmates time to respond to them. Okay, so your replies are due by Sunday at 11:59 p.m., but your first response, your individual response to the questions, is due Thursday night at 11:59 p.m. now. And that's because just this past week, I noticed a lot of people waiting. Soon it was Saturday, and there's still not really many on there. So yeah, just for the sake of everybody, so that you can make sure to get your things done, and give adequate responses. So this is going to be the new rule, okay? And I will send you an email to remind you of that. Okay, so moving into the meat of this week's lecture. So so we're talking about L2 motivational theory, okay? So this is different. So last week we were talking about motivation theory as it was seen in psychology. It's an excellent start. It's kind of like the baseline. It helps us to see exactly where L2 motivation theory comes from. So L2 motivation theory actually was it emerged independently from mainstream motivation theory. Okay, so you had two very separate. They were very separated from each other, and you can see that kind of actually in the stages of development. So you remember that in psychology, motivation theory kind of went from the cognitive revolution or the cognitive period more to the social period, okay, or the social context period. We actually have the opposite, the opposite happening for L2 learning. So we actually start with the social psychological period there. Okay, so this is kind of related to that social context period, although not quite, just because the social psychological period didn't take as much consideration of context as we'll talk about in a few minutes. So that happened from 1959 to 1990, and then we kind of moved on to the cognitive situated period in the 1990s, and then the process-oriented period in the early 2000s, and that's kind of given way now to a more recent development of the complex dynamic systems theory, which we're not going to talk about this week, but that's going to be the subject of chapter 4 for next week. Okay, so we're going to start by going through each of these three stages. So the first one, the social psychological period. So the big names in this one in L2 motivation are Lambert and Gardner. Okay, so they were two researchers, and in particular, it's Gardner. So Lambert Gardner kind of started it, and then Gardner kind of continued with it and became a huge name in this area. Okay, so they're up in French Canada, and they did a lot of motivation research, and they came to the conclusion that motivation to learn a language of the other communities is the key. So, for instance, in Canada, if you are so they're in French Canada. So if you are a person from we'll say English-speaking Canada, I guess, and they move to the province of Quebec. What's going to happen is those people, the main thing that's going to drive them to learn the French language, is that they're going to want to learn. They need to learn. They want to learn the language of the other community. Okay, so they're looking at the other community and they kind of, in a way, want to be part of it. Okay, so this idea of like the motivation to learn language of the other community, it includes these different aspects that Gardner kind of or Lambert and Gardner came up with. So you have the attitudes towards the L2 community and the L2. So obviously, if we want high motivation, we want them to have excellent attitudes towards the L2 community. So if the English-speaking person moves to French-speaking Canada, they have to have an excellent attitude towards those French speakers in the first place to kind of drive them to learn it. And they also have to view French as being a positive as a positive thing. So learning it. Okay. Another thing is ethnocentric orientation. So basically, ethnocentricity is thinking like if you're ethnocentric, you kind of view your own culture as more important and better than others. Okay, so a lot of times we look at this as kind of a demotivating factor. So if you have a high level of ethnocentricity, you're going to be less likely to want to learn another language because you think that your language is the best way to go. Okay, so these three kind of, in Lambert and Gardner's view, they kind of work together. Okay, so they work together to influence language learning behavior. And in both positive and negative ways. Okay, and obviously, so this is a social psychological period, so this is shaped by the social psychological perspective. Okay, so the idea of anything that is external to the person is going to be playing a role and an influence, having an influence on their motivation. Okay. So when we think about Gardner and Lambert, and this is kind of more Gardner in a sense. So basically what they did was they kind of highlighted non-cognitive or affective factors. Okay. So things like emotions essentially would be affective factors. So emotions towards or attitudes towards the L2 and the L2 community. Okay. So they viewed that the cognitive factors that the cognitive revolution in psychology viewed as like all important, they kind of viewed those as insufficient for explaining variability. Okay, so they looked at these motivation in the individuals around them, and they're like, well, these cognitive factors that we were talking about last week, they're not really explaining anything. They're not providing enough information about why certain individuals are performing better than others. Okay, so they kind of wanted to focus more on the social aspect. So you have here they kind of made three different components to L2 motivation based on this. So one is motivational intensity and effort. Okay, so how strongly are you putting effort into this learning task? The desire to learn the language. So how badly do you want to learn it? And attitudes towards learning the language. Okay, so we can see a little bit of like going back to expectancy value theory here in these. So it's not as divorced from cognitive factors or the cognitive period as Gardner and Lambert may have wanted it to be, or at least they didn't make direct connections to it. But so you have, especially when it comes to the desire to learn the language, in a way you have value attached to that. Okay, so people who view it as something that is worthwhile are going to have a higher desire to do that. And they don't necessarily view it as part of that yet, but I know they probably, in fact, I know definitely they later on when they were pushed to kind of incorporate more of these cognitive factors, they did kind of incorporate more of that expectancy value stuff. Okay, so we have that, and then attitudes towards learning the language. Yeah, so more affective factors added there. So how positively do you view the learning process, essentially? Okay, so in their mind, they had motivation is equal to a central mental engine. So in your car, you have the engine which runs it. So motivation is the engine that kind of runs your learning capacity. It makes you it creates the effort and keeps it going. So they kind of separated motivation as, so you have motivation as the will to do something, and then you have orientation. So the orientation is essentially just the goal. Okay, so what's your goal for, what's your ultimate goal in doing this task? Okay, so it's something that comes before motivation, so it's not really motivation itself, but it's part of their framework. Okay, and then they kind of figured out, so goals can actually come in two varieties. Okay, so, and this is actually something we will see a lot more in the literature from today. So we still use these two categories for goals. So you have an integrative goal versus an instrumental goal. Okay, so the integrative motivation, or the instrumental, or the integrative goal, this is essentially the most researched aspect of Gardner's theory. Okay, so so you have basically, you're willing. So an integrative goal is more like you want to be a part of that community. You're really interested in it. You enjoy it. You feel like you can personally get something that will enhance you as a person out of it. So it has three components. Okay, so it has integrativeness, which is the most powerful component of the language-related disposition that Gardner says. So this is kind of the driving force for motivation. Your willingness to want to go forth and become part of that new community, to take up some of its norms, to identify with it, to so this can be things like so for instance, if you're learning Japanese, you might really enjoy reading manga, or you might enjoy trying to read Japanese newspapers, or talking to native Japanese speakers. So these are all the things like integrativeness. So then you also have attitudes towards the learning situation. So how positively do you view or negatively do you view what's going on, like in your own situation for learning? So if you're in the classroom, how much do you like it in the classroom when you're learning the language? Do you view the teacher as being competent? Do you like your classmates? Do you like the tasks that you're assigned to do? If you're learning individually, do you like the way that you're going about this? Do you like the materials you have? Those things. And then motivation itself, so the effort, or the intended, or the effort that you're putting into something. Okay, so these three are all part of that integrated motivation framework. Okay, and then we have the instrumental motivation. So in a sense, this is probably this is related to, so what do you see you as getting out of, what do you see yourself getting out of this, putting forth effort into this task? Okay, so for instance, with people who learn English, they view it as very much a way to get ahead in life. Okay, so they're looking as like a means to an end. They want to be sure to, they want to have prestige. They want to be praised by other people. They want to get a job. They want to travel. So these things would be like similar to like an instrumental motivation. Okay, so be sure that you keep those two separate, integrative and instrumental. They're very different to each other. So you can kind of think more. So if we go back to that intrinsic versus extrinsic dichotomy, you can almost think of integrative motivation as intrinsic and instrumental as extrinsic, but it's not quite there, especially because the instrumental motivation itself is actually related to like goals from within that are like meant to like seek. So you're kind of seeking. The onus comes from yourself. Okay, so you yourself are pushing yourself to get like praise and everything like that. It doesn't come from outside; it comes from inside. Whereas extrinsic is like everything's coming from outside. It has an effect on you, and so you kind of feel like you have to go for it. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know, and I'll explain it better next week. But there is that like a little bit of a difference between those. Okay, and then moving on. So we have Gardner, and then we have Clement. So basically, here we have something called linguistic self-confidence. Okay, so with linguistic self-confidence, we have the focus kind of being on the quality and quantity of contact between two language communities. Okay, so we want to make sure that whatever contact people are having is good. Okay, so it's not just a bunch of grunting and saying yes or I'm sorry or something like that, but that there's actually meaningful conversation going on there. And we want to make sure that the quantity, so the amount of contact between two language communities is sufficient. Okay, so if you're lacking in any of these, so self-confidence kind of wanes a little bit. Okay, so it kind of shows that you're not really willing to go forth and kind of talk with those people very often in meaningful ways. Okay, but the more you do so, the more confident or more self-confidence there is. So basically, they kind of view this as or Clement views this as like a socially constructed construct or a factor. Okay, so basically, people have to work together in order to become more self-confident or less self-confident. And then so we have this as like a socially constructed variable, but we also need to remember that it's cognitively constructed as well. So this is kind of the cognitive construct is related to perceived altitude proficiency that we saw last week. So basically, your kind of like going back to self-efficacy theory or your judgments about yourself. So how do you perceive your capabilities or your competencies in this area? Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then we have also Giles and Byrne. They came up with this intergroup model. Okay, so basically talking about the conditions under which members of a minority ethnic group will acquire dominant language. Okay, so so if you have like people who are say you have like a group of people from India or a community from an Indian community, and they're living in the middle of let's see, Midwest America. So the idea here is that you're going to look at the conditions of those people and whether or not they will acquire the dominant language of English in that area. Okay, and so a lot of this has to do with social identity as well. So which they define as like the aspects of self-image coming from different social groups. Okay, so the self-image can be both positive and negative. So they can view it being Indian as a great thing, or they can view it as being an unfortunate thing that impedes them from going further. Okay, so these two things kind of like working together with each other to affect whether or not a language is learned. Okay, so when we talk about their theory, we look at these different situations in which language or the group will actually acquire the dominant language. Okay, so for instance, we have a minority group and a dominant group that are kind of almost on equal grounds with each other. So, say like what's a good example would be like okay, so say somebody like from Western Europe moved here. Okay, so we'll say somebody from France, for instance. Generally, people from that area of Europe will not feel any sense of inferiority. So if they move to America, they won't feel a sense of inferiority to Americans. So I mean, there's that, and then, or if they have like something that's related to, or they have a language that's related to the dominant groups, okay, or they're strongly related to the dominant group. So for instance, if what's a good example? The only thing I can really think of right now would be like um, people from like Germany moving to or Amsterdam. So we'll say this. So in Michigan, where I'm from, there's a big Dutch community. So if people or people who are related to Dutch and whatnot. So if somebody was from or not Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and moved over to Michigan, for instance, they might not feel they're so related to the dominant group that they might not feel that it's necessary. I mean, it's a horrible. That's not the greatest example because people in the Netherlands basically all speak English fluently anyway. But you get the idea. So if two groups are related to each other very strongly, um, and um, one group doesn't really feel inferior to the other, or the minority group doesn't really feel inferior to the dominant group, then they're probably going to be more likely to acquire a language. Okay, so there's that. And then, so we also look at the difference between strong versus weak boundary groups. So you can see here that I have a dotted circle versus a full circle. Okay, so if you have like a dominant or a strong group boundary, like in the first circle there, the idea is that you're probably like the connection between the two groups is not going to be that great. Okay, so you probably won't see much of the minority group learning the dominant language. On the other hand, if we have the minority group and they have kind of weak group boundaries, so they don't really feel that they have to separate themselves from the dominant group. They want to actually, the idea here is that they actually want to become integrated with it. Then they kind of want to be, so the in-group people from there actually want to join the out-group people, and so they're going to be more likely to learn the dominant language and become proficient with it. Okay, another thing. So the minority and dominant group. So if you have a social status in the minority group that is actually lower than the dominant group, the minority group people will probably want to learn the dominant language as fast as possible so that they can actually get out of that lower social status. So they want to actually be associated with the same social status that the dominant group has. The same goes for numbers. So if you have a small number of minority group, a small number of people in the minority group, and compared to the dominant group, they probably are going to be more likely to learn the dominant language. Whereas if you have a large number of people in the minority group compared to the dominant group, they're not going to be as likely to do that. So an example of that might be like Miami. Okay, so we have a lot of Spanish speakers in Miami. So the Cuban community and I guess Puerto Rican community as well. So I mean, you have a lot of Spanish speakers there. So and often we hear that they don't really feel the need to completely integrate with the dominant group. I guess it's not really a dominant group anymore because there's almost like equal numbers, but they don't really want to learn the dominant language of the U.S., which would be English, because of that. So and we see that kind of in the education systems there, where they have like dual language programs where they have English and Spanish schools and whatnot. So there's that. And then we have this. So you have this sad little stick man here who's where it says, so the L1 is spoken very little or they have a weak identity. Okay, so so if they're at home and their L1 is spoken very little with them, they're going to be pushed more. In order to actually communicate, they have to learn the dominant language, essentially. So they're going to probably become more proficient in the dominant language. Another thing, so if they have a weak identity, so if they don't actually identify very well with their in-group, okay, so For instance, if you're moving here and you're from China, you might not, and you don't really identify yourself as Chinese. You're going to be more likely to identify yourself as American then, and then learn English. Okay, so the idea here is that the more strongly you are, you see yourself as being identified with the dominant group, the more likely you're going to learn the dominant group's language and become proficient at it and then at a native like level. Okay, so a few other psychological theories some of you are probably familiar with. So acculturation theory, we talked a lot about this. If you've taken SLS 302, I know my class talked about this, and I think a few others have. I know a few others have as well. But basically, we're looking here at like the distance between one group and another. Okay, so the idea that social and psychological distance are there, and they kind of affect motivation to learn in L2 and the ultimate attainment of the L2. Okay, so the more distance you are from that dominant group, socially and psychologically. So socially, if you're on like a lower social status, so if you're like at the very end or very bottom of the social ladder compared to others, and then if you are psychologically, if you put like a mental block there yourself where you think, oh, well, I'm not good enough, I'm not anywhere near like them, I can't ever possibly be part of that group, you're going to basically make it so that you're going to set yourself up to fail at learning in L2 because you'll have less motivation to do it generally, and it'll affect your ultimate ability to speak it. Okay, another one, so a situated identity theory. Basically, yeah, so looking at situational factors. So what the different types of factors that come into play in different contexts, essentially. So how does the context affect whether or not you become a member in different groups? Okay, we talked about that last week a little bit. Okay, so then we have all that from the from the social period. So, I mean, we see like it's very focused on the social aspects, but so like we had last time with the cognitive revolution in psychology, you can't really have one without the other. You have to you have to have both combined. You can't have them in isolation, or they don't really explain very much. And so Peter Skean kind of saw this in 1989. He was like, okay, basically all the research that we've done in motivation this entire time has been based on Gardner's agenda. So we've all just basically been like saying, oh, kudos to Gardner, we're just going to prove everything that you said, and we're not really making any headway in this area. We need to actually expand the construct a little bit more. Okay, so so basically what he did was he pushed for a new perspective. And the idea is here is that, well, if we just look at social standing and things on their own, it's kind of impractical. We can't change what the student's social standing is. So we need to actually focus more in the classroom of what we're doing, or how this relates to the classroom, and how we can apply. Okay, so this is when the kind of situated period began. Okay, so we basically, here was the push to kind of bring what we saw in the cognitive revolution in psychology and bring it into L2 motivation research. Okay, so which is kind of funny because it was at this time the cognitive revolution was starting to wind down, and there was more of a push for social context to be taken into consideration. But anyway, so there's a push to include the stuff from the cognitive revolution that was found in psychology. And there was also a push to sharpen the focus of research. Okay, so we wanted more situated analyses. So looking in the classroom, looking at home, looking how the person acts with their peer groups, how they interact with the teacher or parent. So how does this all affect it? Okay, so basically in SLA, we wanted to make sure that motivation research became more practical. Okay, so it's great to have theories, but if you can't apply them, what use are they? Okay, so it's important to know here that it did not call for completely discarding the social psychology frameworks that had been developed by Gardner. So Gardner, everybody thinks that Gardner's theory is great, and it makes a lot of sense. But the idea here was we needed to broaden and expand the framework. So we needed to actually include more of this stuff from the cognitive revolution. So for instance, expectancy value theory, self-determination theory, all those things that we talked about last week needed to actually be brought into this as well. Okay. So basically Gardner and others, so they began to incorporate goal salience, valence, and self-efficacy into these new this new framework. Okay, so they expanded the framework to include these. So you have goal salience, basically meaning so how specific and how easy or distant is the goal from the person. Okay, so if it's something they can't really see or it's really far off, it's going to affect the motivation. It's going to make it so that motivation is decreased. Okay, so there's that. And like we said last week, if it's too vague, it's going to be too easy to accomplish. It needs to be more specific. And it needs to be challenging. Valence, it's a fancy word for value. So what value is attached to the task itself? And then self-efficacy. So as we talked about last week, basically seeing how confident do you view yourself as being in the completion of this task. Okay. So what we see here is we expand the L2 motivation framework to include those three things. And we came to this, and in L2 motivation, we came to the conclusion that there are various levels of motivation and learning that need to be distinguished. Okay, so Crooks and Schmidt, from our very own department of SLS, they actually decided that, oh, well, if we look at Keller's education-oriented theory of motivation, we can actually apply this directly to our L2 motivation framework. Looking at what we already have, we can actually easily incorporate these four components. So basically, the four components are like these. So you have interest. So basically, the intrinsic value of the task that's being done. So is it something that the person enjoys? Are they personally interested in it, et cetera, et cetera. The relevance. So how will this help them in the future? What value is placed to it? Expectancy, so going back to self-efficacy again. And then satisfaction. So going back and seeing, okay, so I've accomplished this goal or I've accomplished this task. How happy I am with how I accomplished it. Okay, so how happy am I with the outcome? Okay. So this is where we came to with motivation theory. And then, so based on that, so Dornier, who we will be hearing a lot of in a couple of weeks here, starting next week, really. So he came up with this 3-level framework. Okay, so we look at how these different components relate to these 3 different levels. Okay, so we have the language level, looking at the integrated and instrumental subsystems. So whether it's so what are the purposes or the goals behind the language learning? The learner level, their need for achievement. So how high is their need to actually show that they can accomplish this? And then things like affective things, like so their perceived competence, their self-efficacy, their language use, their language use anxiety. So things that might either promote or prevent learners from experimenting or using the language. Okay. And then we have the learning situation level. So this is actually split into further categories. I'm sure you're noticing a theme now where every single theory of motivation is split into at least 3 different categories. I don't know why. I mean, I guess it makes it easier to see, but it can be confusing if all this is being thrown at you once. So sorry, just stick with me here. A good way to keep this all straight is just to kind of write it down and practice on your own. So the learning situation level has 3 components. So the course specific, teacher specific, and group specific. The course specific is basically looking at interest in the course, how relevant the course is to the learner's needs, how expectancy again. So how do they think that they're going to be successful? You have the teacher specific situation. So authority type. So how authoritative are they? Let's see. How well do they model tasks? What type of feedback do they do? They give feedback. Without feedback, a lot of times we'll find that learners actually just kind of give up because they don't know how they're doing. So those things. Group specific. So goal orientatedness. So how does the group work together to create a common goal? For one thing, and how clear is the goal? Do they all work towards that same goal? Group cohesiveness, so yeah, working together, and class goal structure. So how, as a class, do they work together towards a singular objective? Okay. And then we have social constructivist theory. So we've already talked about this. This basically goes back to the Vygotsky and sociocultural theory. But we have learner internal and learner external factors. Okay, so so what types of things are driving the person internally? So interest again, their goals, so perceived self-efficacy versus learner external factors. So what types of pressures are being placed by them, around them, by the people around them? How badly do they want to prove to others that they can succeed, and how important is it, and how they perceive those others as let me rephrase it. So how important they so how important they perceive it to be to those around them as well. Okay, so if they think that the teacher finds it very important that they specifically are good at doing something, or can prove that they can do this task, they'll be an external factor to them. Okay. Yeah, so motivation results from individual influences as well as social and contextual influences. Yeah, so going back to that same, so learner internal versus learner external factors. Okay, so you'll notice in this chapter there's a lot of like things with areas of inquiry. I'm not going to focus a lot of these on a lot of those for the lecture. You can look through those and read them on your time. Some of them we'll look at further by looking at the articles or looking at the articles related to them. But the key and things I want you to remember from this is, so a lot of times they talk, so a lot of times the authors talk about quantitative versus qualitative traditions in these areas of inquiry. Okay, so in motivation, I think the typical study or research has been done in a quantitative manner. Okay, so one of the readings that you'll do for next week by Poppy, his is a very quantitative study. Okay, so quantitative studies are essentially like anything looking at numbers, large quantities of numbers. So a lot of times in motivation, quantitative studies will be done using surveys. Okay, so for instance, I did one a year back ago, and at that time I used a survey. It had a scale of 1 to 5 on it, and so basically I sent it out. I got like 600 responses, and then I analyzed it using different statistics to see what types of patterns there were. Okay, so the authors make a good point, is like, this is a good way to get a global view of what's going on. But then we have the qualitative tradition, which is kind of looking at more, you spend more time with the individual. So you have a smaller sample size, and you essentially follow the person around for a while. You kind of do like case studies, ethnographies. It's very descriptive in nature. And so this is actually a good way for, as the authors say, it's a good way to kind of get an idea of how things are changing. So when we look at next week at like the dynamic systems theory, we'll see that qualitative traditions are actually more useful in a sense, because they actually let us see, like, so how does motivation change over time? How does it change in the context? Things like that. So what I want you to just make sure you know is that either method is not bad. Okay, so there's going to be downsides to either one, but basically the main thing to know is that they have their strengths and weaknesses. The strongest studies will actually attempt to combine the two together. So having a large survey and then taking a subsample of that population and kind of following them around or doing interviews with them or something like that later on. Okay. So the last thing that we're going to be looking at is the process-oriented period. Okay, so this kind of came out of the last one with all the weaknesses that we kind of saw with what was going on with a lot of these issues with not being able to see what was going on while or what was happening to the motivation as things happen. So specifically, like having people when people do a task, their motivation level will change over time and has to be sustained for that entire task. So the idea here with process-oriented period, the process-oriented period is to kind of figure out, so what's the dynamic nature of motivation? Okay, so we want to look at, so what does it take? So let's start here first. So you have the two distinctions made. So motivation for engagement and motivation during engagement. Okay, so basically the process-oriented period of motivation research is more interested in so the differences between what it takes to initiate motivation or motivation for starting the task, and what does it take to or sustain that motivation. Okay, so Ushioda, who will read later on in the semester too, she actually focuses a little bit more on this, looking at the change over time and how you can kind of see you can turn from like an integrative to a more instrumental motivation over time, depending on, or the other way as well. So it really depends on what's going on with the person. Okay, so the idea here between process-oriented theory is that we want to see what's going on. So what's happening in that time. Okay, so in process-oriented theory, we have a sequence of events. Okay, so essentially the process, and it's like, and these events are within a chain of initiating and sustaining motivated behavior. So you have, on the one hand, you have initiating motivated behavior, and on the other hand, sustaining it. Okay, so you have the first sequence. Okay, so you have the action sequence, and so in this case, you start with the initial wishes, hopes, and desires, and those become goals. The goals become intentions. The intentions become actions. The actions become accomplishments of the goals, and then the accomplishment turns into the evaluation. Okay. So that's basically what's going on. So we're looking at the process of going from initial wishes to evaluation. Okay, and then during these different action sequences, you have the motivational influences that are taking place. You have energy sources. So where's the energy coming from for this sustained effort? And then you have the motivational forces. So and then the actual effort itself. Okay. Okay, so we have three main phases. So you have the pre-actional phase. So this would be where you have the goals and the hopes and wishes that turn into goals. So you have to first select the goals. And so in this case, we're looking at things like goal setting, intention formation, and the initiation of the intention enactment. Okay, so we go basically from setting the goal, intending to complete it, and then actually starting it. Okay. And so in here we have the key influences or motivational influences that are like the value that's attached to the process, the goal properties, so whether the goals are vague or specific, whether they're difficult or easy, things like that, expectancy of success, so whether or not we actually think that we can be successful in this, etc. Okay, so next you have the actional phase. So you go from initiating the action to actually doing the action. Okay, so it's this is associated with the executive motivation, which maintains the action. And yeah, so we go from decision making to implementation. So you have three processes here. So you have the subtask generation and implementation. Yeah, so this is basically breaking a task down to smaller parts. So for instance, if we're like doing a task of learning a language and becoming proficient in it, we're going to break it down into smaller parts. So if you're taking a class, for instance, this will be done almost for you. So for instance, if you're learning English, you'll start off with the alphabet, and then you'll start off with some basic vocabulary, and then some basic grammar. So looking at like the present progressive or the simple present, and then going from there. So you want to show breaking the task into smaller parts so you can see your mastery at each of those steps. Appraisal, so monitoring your progress along the task. So as you're doing the task, you'll be like, well, is this working, or do I need to modify what I'm doing? Okay, and then are you happy? And also looking, are you happy with your progress, or do you need to speed up or slow down, or something like that? And then you have the action control. So self-regulation to protect your motivation. Okay, so basically you want to basically look at what types of things. So what self-regulating strategies are you using as a way to make sure that your motivation is not harmed, or to make sure you're not demotivated by something. Okay, so in these cases, you have the main motivational influences as being the quality of the experience. So is it good? Is there something meaningful coming out of it, or is it just very surface level? Autonomy. So do you actually perceive this as something where you have say in what you're doing? Do you have control over your learning, or is everything being told to you? Like, are you being told exactly how you need to learn? And then social influences. So those around you. So how are they acting with the task as well? So if you have peers who are learning the same task, how are they treating it? What types of pressures are being put on you, etc. Okay, and then finally we have the post-actional phase. So this is kind of like the retrospection. So looking back after the fact and seeing, so did this work out? So how happy am I with this? You evaluate the outcome and then figure out, so should I change this in the future? Am I going to do something like this similar in the future? And how am I going to make it better? Okay, and then so here you have basically motivational influences, so attributional factors. So if it was a success, you're going to probably have a more you're either going to attribute it to dumb luck, or you're going to attribute it to something within you. Okay, so some sort of ability. If it turns out horribly, you'll either say that you are incompetent, or you'll say something like, "Oh well, the effort wasn't enough," or "This was just really hard, so I need to break it down further." Okay, self-concept. So that's going back to attributional factors a little bit. So how well do you view yourself as being capable, and then external feedback from others. So in a learning environment, you may get feedback from a teacher letting you know how you've progressed. Okay, so basically when we think about research on process-oriented motivation, we think about how the situation changes occur in our right. So we think about how motivation changes with in regards to the specific situation. So Gardner, who is in a French-speaking part of Canada, will actually says that French integrativeness is much more, or he looks at French, the motivation to learn French. He actually found that integrativeness, because of the population or the area that he was in, it was actually very prone to being greatly influenced. Okay, so he could see very sharp drops or very sharp rises in it very easily due to because of the situation they were in, and because of the different factors. So the different factors apparently had a very strong influence on that because of the availability of the French community around there. And then you had Dornier and Caesar, who looked at English in Hungary. So whether or not English was being or the motivation behind, or the effects of different factors on the motivation to learn English in Hungary. Okay, so they found that instrumentalness actually there was much more prone to be influenced by different factors. Okay, and that's mainly the main difference we've seen here is that so context actually has a big influence on what factors in that motivation system is going to be are going to be the most important and the most influenced or most easily influenced. Okay, so in terms of English, English is often viewed as a language that people need in order to succeed and get ahead. So instrumentalness will definitely be highly connected to learning that. However, if we have like French, oftentimes French is not necessarily viewed as something that's going to be super essential for getting ahead. It's often taken out of interest. And so if people are learning French in Canada, they're going to probably be more likely to have an integrated motivational mindset. So they're going to want to be part of that community or integrate more with that community. So in this case, people are going to, that integrativeness or those integrative goals are going to be, the integrated motivation is going to be easily affected. Okay, so that's some research has been done with situation-specific changes. We've also seen research with changes over an individual's lifespan. So, following a couple individuals over a few years to see how their motivation levels change, and then also looking at self-regulatory strategies. So, how do we move from being completely extrinsically motivated to being more intrinsically motivated along that continuum. Okay, and then when we talk about weaknesses of the process model, so there are two main weaknesses here, which is the main reason why we have the dynamic systems model now that we talk about. So we have basically the first one being the assumption that actional processes can be defined precisely and separated from each other. There's going to be overlap, obviously. So this is theory based. We can't see it. It's something that's going on within individuals. So generally, those phases cannot be strictly delineated from each other. Okay, and then the other one is that the action processes occur in isolation of other action processes. So actually, it's extremely likely, possible and likely that several action processes are happening at the same time. So it's not necessarily a step-by-step process, but it could be something that's where everything's kind of has some sort of a role depending on where they are in the task. Okay, so this is the main reason why the dynamic systems theory kind of arose. It kind of takes all of this into account, like because we know that we can't completely separate actions, and we can't make sure that, and we know that they don't follow a strictly linear path. So the dynamic systems theory kind of accounts for that more. We'll talk more about that next week, though. Okay, so that basically brings me to the end of this. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll answer them. For this week, pretty simple again. So you have discussion forum number 3. So the main post for that is due on Thursday at 11:59 p.m. And then you have replies to 2 classmates due on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Okay? So no late responses are accepted this time around. So make sure that you do it on time, otherwise it's a 0. Okay? And then finally, so for this week, you are going to read Dorni and Ushio chapter 4, and then you're going to read Papi 2010. Okay? And then for next week, you'll have your first reading quiz, which we won't do it this week, but next week you will. Okay, so I'm just warning you that's going to be something extra you'll have to do next week. And this is all on the course calendar as well. Okay, so for the Papi reading, just make sure that you go here. So the course website under resources, readings, and then you'll see it here. So Papi 2010, file, click on the file. So you have the L2 motivational self system, L2 anxiety and motivated behavior. Okay. So this is a this is actually using some more advanced statistics. I don't want you to get too bogged down with everything, including like, so he'll talk about things like fit indices and whatnot. But for the most part, it's pretty well written and it's not difficult to follow. So basically, just focus on what he says about the theory, and how he's relating all these different traits to each other. Okay, so you'll see all of this, and then kind of focus a little bit more also on what types of applications there might be. So you'll have probably one question next week on this that will ask you to kind of consider the applications of of the article of the findings. Okay, I think that's it for now. If you have any questions, just email me. Let me know. Otherwise, have a good week, and I hope you enjoy reading up about the dynamic systems theory.